Hi, I'm Iris Wilbur-Glick, the president of Louisville Forum, and welcome to our August meeting. We typically meet on the second Wednesday of each month at Vincenzo's Restaurant in downtown Louisville, and all are welcome. Founded in 1984, the Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group that hosts debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our programs, or to make reservations, please visit louisvilleforum.org. So today's program, a freshman's perspective on the 118th U.S. Congress. So, yes, here we go. So Morgan McGarvey is with us today, serving as Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District, a representative in the U.S. House. Elected in November of 22, he's a lifelong Louisvillian who, before being elected to Congress, served for a decade in the Kentucky State Senate, including 4 years as the minority leader of the Senate Democratic Caucus. During his time in the state legislature, I witnessed firsthand his dedication to a whole array of issues, but my favorite memories were the times where he could lean on the relationships he built with his colleagues in both parties to pass legislation. During the congressman's time in Frankfort, he wrote and passed 18 bills into law. He graduated from Manual High School and earned his BA in journalism from the University of Missouri, where he met his wife, Chris, and then he earned his JD from UK School of Law. He and Chris and their 3 children live in the Highlands. So welcome. Join me in welcoming Morgan McGarvey, our congressman.
Thank you, Iris. It's I will tell you, it is wonderful to be here. I will tell you, it's the last time I was here, I was debating an opponent. The time before that, I was debating an opponent. So it really is great to be here, here today in this capacity. It's sort of like today's the first day of school for us parents here in Jefferson County. I have middle schoolers as of today, which is unbelievable. And then one who unfortunately is not in school yet, but we've got middle schoolers, so it's that first day of school. It feels like that being back here at the Louisville Forum in this capacity. I've been here as the Senate Minority Leader, but fun to be here as the congressman from my hometown here in Louisville, Kentucky. Today's topic, of course, is about what it's like to be a freshman in the 118th Congress. And I will tell you, to paraphrase the Grateful Dead, what a long, strange trip it's been. To start the 118th Congress, it was historic, meaning we did not elect a speaker for the first time in 100 years on the first ballot. It took 15 ballots. It's the longest it's taken in 150 years to elect a Speaker of the House. And from there, things kept on rolling. So, when I went to Frankfort, my whole thing about going to Frankfort was I'm going to go up, I'm going to fight for my constituents while staying true to my values and actually working to get things done. And when I was running to go to Congress, that was the same approach I took. Now that I'm in Congress, that is absolutely the approach I have. Let's fight, but let's work to get things done. And so I had a plan. And then, of course, now I've quoted the Grateful Dead, I'll quote Mike Tyson. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And as we were confronting both the debt ceiling and some of the issues looming large on the national scene, Louisville suffered a collective punch to the face when we suffered the first mass shooting in our community in nearly 30-something years. And that has informed a lot of my time in this first Congress as well. I've joined the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, and we're doing really serious work to combat the epidemic of gun violence. I think we have to have a holistic conversation about guns in this country. And that means, yes, we've got to talk about crime. We have to talk about crime. We have to talk about the root causes of crime and everything from employment to education to housing. We have to talk about mental health in this country. And we've got to talk about the shortage and even the non-sexy topics of mental health, such as reimbursement rates for providers and how we can get more mental health people here. And we have to talk about the guns themselves. As we saw in our community, someone who was suffering, who had been seeing someone for help, was able to go in and buy an assault-style rifle in under an hour, and 6 days later, kill 5 of his colleagues and injure 8 others before his life was taken. So we're doing this in a way that I have done in Frankfort, which is not in front of the press, not in front of social media, but making literally spreadsheets with members' names on them, going to them and saying, where can you meet us? Where can we make progress on this? Because you know what? The issues of gun violence are no longer Democrat or Republican. They're not choosing victims based on parties. This is happening in towns across our country. And so we're really working on that. We've got the budget coming up as well, and that's going to take up a lot of focus in the coming weeks. And then, of course, you know, we're trying to find your own footing in a body of 435 people from across the country has been interesting and fun. And one of the ways I'm trying to meet people and, of course, forge those relationships that Iris, you said, are so important is I am proud to say that in my freshman term, I am chairman of a caucus. It's the Bourbon Caucus. But I do believe in the soft power of bourbon, and bourbon diplomacy is a real thing. So Andy Barr, actually from Lexington, is my co-chair, and we've already had 2 bipartisan bourbon tastings just to get people together, to talk, to enjoy America's spirit, and working on that as well. So I appreciate you guys having me. I'm actually looking forward to the questions. I'm not going to filibuster up here with opening remarks, but before I close, I will say that being back here is wonderful. But it's been 2 years. It's still hard not to see David Hopp scribbling furiously on notes for tough questions at this front table. I am glad, though, or I say I'm glad, maybe I won't be, that Steve Ford and Debbie Yetter are in those seats as well, because I imagine the questions will be coming. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Congressman. A reminder, we do have those question slips at your table. So I'm going to read off a couple up here, and then during that time, invite you all to submit questions. Upon completion, just wave them up. A board member will grab those from you, and we'll get to the audience portion here momentarily. So Congressman, I know I'm really tempted to call you by your first name, but you deserve and respect that.
No.
Respect the seat of the office for sure. So Congressman McGarvey, you mentioned relationships, critical, right? Because when you're one of 435, right? So partisanship aside, majority minority aside, I mean, you can't get anything done by yourself. So kind of share with us, a little bit of what that's been like, 7+ months in, what that's like, and particularly working across the aisle, which you have a solid track record of doing that here at home. I know I can speak from personal experience. Like, one of my sort of proud moments in Frankfurt, I have a Republican political background working in policy, but we were able to work together on the Kentucky pregnant workers fairness legislation, which was just a great milestone for the Commonwealth and to support working moms, working families. And so kind of just share with us what it's been like so far trying to develop these relationships to advance a policy agenda.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's relationships are so important, and I think people often think of politics different than any other job. Or like, look, if you work in corporate America, if you work at a law firm, if you work as an educator, wherever it is you work, you have to have relationships in your office place. You fall back on those relationships so you can succeed, so you can move forward. And it's no different working in Congress. In fact, if it's not different, maybe it's more important to have those relationships. So in Frankfurt, I learned early on, and it stayed with me in Frankfurt. It's with me now in Washington. First of all, you can have disagreements. That's totally okay. We don't have to agree on how to solve every problem. But make it about the policy and don't make it personal. Just because someone disagrees with you on a solution to a problem doesn't mean they're necessarily a bad person. So leave it to the policy. Don't make it personal. I also view bipartisanship as it's not agreement. That doesn't mean bipartisanship. Bipartisanship to me is the willingness to listen. And when you listen to people, when you have those relationships and you listen to people and you find out about them, then you start to find common ground. There's a guy who's my age, Jason Smith, from one of the most conservative districts in Missouri. I think he's an R+28 district. To put that in non-political terms, no Democrats getting elected in that district, right? And so, all of a sudden I walk into the House gym one morning and I've got on a University of Missouri t-shirt. Iris mentioned I went there for undergrad. I met my wife there, who's a Missouri girl, and I've got a Missouri. And he said, "Hey, what's that on your shirt?" And I looked down and it's a Missouri Tiger. Come to find out, we lived in the same dorm the same year, our freshman year at the University of Missouri. Well, then you start talking to him. You know, the guy, he loves ice cream. He's coming to Louisville later this month. I'm taking him to Grader's or Louisville Creamery, right, to get ice cream. And we don't agree on every issue, but you find those relationships. You find ways to get along. Look for opportunities. I'm being dead serious about bourbon. It makes Kentucky cool. People like it. I've got a lot of it in my office, and we're happy to share it with people. I joined the congressional baseball team this year, which is a wonderful way, albeit very early in the morning, to get to know people in Washington in a way where you're not talking about legislation and you're doing something fun. We raised a bunch of money for charity. Democrats and Republicans come together. I think they've done it every year since 1909. So there's ways to make those relationships, but I think it's so important, and I hope it pays dividends on the policy front going down the road.
And so that's the thing, Congressman. Like, if you scroll through social media, or sometimes if you're watching sort of the evening news, they paint a very different picture, as if you don't even make contact with one another. Like, if you're trying to, advance some kind of policy and, there's maybe a clear divide, I mean, how do you sort of approach that? And I'm glad you brought up the congressional baseball game, because I do think sort of that tradition really isn't known amongst, widely known amongst, not only Republican Democrats that are in the Beltway on the Hill, but just across the country. I don't think they understand how sort of those opportunities to build relationships are so vital, right? Without those opportunities, I mean, how do you forge these sort of coalitions to advance something, right? Because the House Republicans, they have the majority, but it's a very slim majority, right? And so the dynamic there is interesting. So yeah, talk about your baseball debut. I mean, you got a single hit and you scored a run. I mean, that's pretty awesome.
I think the saying in Kentucky is even a blind squirrel finds an acorn. It was so much fun. I would love to try and downplay it, but I mean, they play the game at the National Stadium. So there you are at a Major League Baseball park. I wore the Bellarmine jersey to honor one of our good friends from Manual High School who passed away from cancer, but played baseball at Bellarmine. And so to have on that jersey and to get a hit, my family, my kids, my parents were in the crowd. I got a great hit, and I got a great hit. And they tell you to act like you've been there before. I've never been there before. So I'm waving and pointing at the kids and acting like an idiot, but it was so much fun to be out there and to be out there with colleagues from both sides of the aisle, House and the Senate, raise all that money for charity and do it in a fun way. It was just a really great experience.
So I will say, although the scoreboard, we don't have to talk about the final score, but
I got slaughtered.
And I mean, maybe that was like the third consecutive year, I think, that the Republicans were victorious. But mind you, I encourage sort of Democratic leadership to maybe consider you more of an asset come next year. So hopefully that's in the making.
We're going to work on it. I like, and looking at the teams, I mean, not to project for next year, but I liked the ages of the two teams. I think they might have some experience now. We'll see if that pays off for them in a couple of years.
So speaking of, so we got members. So Kentucky federal delegation, I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I think we have the best delegation in the country, particularly when it comes to constituent services. And I know that's something that's not widely talked about, but I mean, that's where rubber meets the road. I mean, if you're not showing value, if you're not leveraging your office to advance, very important priorities for your constituents, what's it all about? And so kind of talk about your approach to constituent services, how your staff is on the front lines, sort of what are the shakeups that you're making that maybe are not traditional?
Yeah, constituent services is the bread and butter of the office. I found that out in Frankfurt. It's even more true in Washington. In fact, I'm coming here right now from mobile office hours. We're starting a mobile office where we're going out in the community. So we were downtown today, but we'll be in the coming weeks in Fairdale, in Shawnee, in Shelby Park, in Southwest Jefferson County. We're going all over Louisville to try and meet people where they are. We have people call us all the time. We've had over 400 people call this year already about passports, which you wouldn't think about, but we've had, by the way, if you're traveling out of the country, check your passport, please, now. It helps us out. But, we've got so many things, and I think it's important on the state government. It's even more important on the federal government. Our job as a member of Congress is we are the tangible representative for the people of Louisville to their government. And when people call us, it's not because things are going well. And so our goal and our job is to be incredibly attentive and to get you an answer. It doesn't mean it's the answer you want or the answer we want, but it's to get you that answer, to push for that resolution so you know what to do next. And we've got a great team. I've got Amy Washburn, who's my district director here today. I've got Joni Jenkins, who was retired for about 5 days before we brought her on into the office. And then, of course, John Yarmouth did a wonderful job at Constituent Services. And we were really fortunate to keep some of his top people in the district office to do constituent services. So we've got a good team, and from the state Senate to Congress, there's no difference. That is such an important part of what we do.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. Again, I just think that's sort of kind of behind the scenes. People don't really think about it, but I mean, it's critical. That's how you connect with constituents and really get stuff done, big and small, right? So let's talk about committees. That's a whole process. So those of us that are really living this all the time, committee assignments could be everything.
Yeah.
And so kind of share with us sort of your expectations, maybe on the front end, now that you're 7 months in, sort of the groove of it all.
Yeah, so committees are incredibly important, and they're incredibly important to your priorities, how you carry forward the legislation that interests you. I will tell you, it was tough for me going into the situation because the Democrats lost the majority, went into the minority. That has a practical effect on committees because they lose seats. And so when the Democrats lose seats on committees, as a freshman, it's harder to get one of those committees. So you look at some of what we consider kind of the exclusive or the big committees in Washington, Ways and Means, Appropriations, Energy and Commerce. There's not a single freshman Democrat on any one of those committees. We're in the minority this year, even if you're a frontline Democrat, meaning your chances of reelection aren't as secure on the front end. They're not on one of those committees. The Education and Labor Committee, which is, I've always been a big proponent of education and workers' rights, not a single freshman on that committee for the Democrats. So, going from the majority to the minority is tough, and when you're in a seniority-based body, makes it hard to get on some of those committees your first term. I ended up on 2 great committees, though, and I'm excited about the committees I'm on. I'm on the Veterans Committee, which we have about 50,000 veterans in the Louisville area. Fort Knox, we get a lot of people here who retire here. And then I'm on the Small Business Committee, which, of course, the lifeblood of our economy is still small business. I think it also suits my personality. Those 2 committees are committees where still people work together. Look at veterans issues. If we can't agree on how to take care of the people who are willing to put on a uniform and sacrifice everything for us, where can we find common ground? I don't care if you're in a small town in Kansas or California or New Jersey or Kentucky, you've got small businesses that make your community run. And so we're worried about the same things. Even sometimes we might have different solutions to some of it. We're worried about the same things. How do we keep our small businesses afloat? How do we make sure that we have the workforce we need for our small businesses and our trades in the future? How do we make sure that underrepresented communities and women and minority-owned businesses have the access to capital that they need to have a fair shake at getting a start? And so these have been really great committees to get my feet wet and work on some issues where we can find bipartisan agreement and make some progress.
So again, 7+ months in, right? So still trying to kind of figure some things out, but you're not new to the Hill. You actually started out as a congressional staffer. And so those of you who may not know, maybe you can share just a little bit of that, and obviously fast forward, probably feels like a lifetime ago. Now you're a voting member.
Yeah, it's totally bizarre and weird. Ben Chandler, I worked for Ben Chandler for almost 2 years, and I was his driver when he was running for governor. So I went everywhere with him. And then worked on his congressional campaign, and he of course he was back up. In the governor's race, he ran against Ernie Fletcher, who was the member of Congress from the Lexington area. Ernie Fletcher, of course, beats him in the governor's race, which creates a vacancy for the member of Congress. The Congress, one of the reasons I love the House, we're the people's house. We're the only federal position you have to be elected to serve. You can get appointed president, you get appointed to the Senate, you get appointed to a judge. You've got to get elected by the people to serve in Congress. So there's a special election when Fletcher left the congressional seat. Chandler wins, and he looks at me and two other guys, Clint Dockery and Jason Sauer. And he says, I want my office open at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So we got in the car that night at the victory party and drove through the night and opened up the office at 9 a.m. I was only there a couple of months before going to law school, but opened up a congressional office, never thought I would be back there in any capacity whatsoever. And to be back there now on the same floor of Longworth where Chandler had his office is kind of a little moment of kismet, for sure.
Awesome. Again, a reminder, please get your questions and we'll move to those here in a moment. So mentorship, you mentioned seniority, right? There's folks sort of in that lineup, but not to out anybody, you mentioned a colleague from Missouri, but any other members that have sort of reached out to you, maybe in like a mentorship capacity that you've really been able to benefit from so far?
Yeah, and I'll start with the one we're assigned. So the nice thing about Congress is I'm not the first freshman member of Congress ever. I'm not going to be the last freshman member of Congress. And so they assign a mentor. I've got really lucky. A guy named Joe Nagoose from the Colorado area is kind of my mentor, has become a friend. He and his wife have young kids. They kind of get a lot of what we're going through. And so he's been a mentor in everything from what committee assignments do I want next? What track do I want to take in the House? How to handle the votes? How to handle the family and the personal stuff that a lot of us go through. I mean, I'll tell you, the hardest part of this job is leaving. And my wife works full time. His wife works. We've got small kids, and what that looks like, and the village we have to have of support to make it all work. So he's been wonderful. Jamie Raskin has been really helpful as well, just to mention a few, but a lot of people. There's camaraderie there, and you mentioned it. What the news media shows is the conflict, and of course they do. I mean, if you turned on the nightly news and you saw us agreeing on stuff, it wouldn't be that interesting. And so, we pass bills every week that have mostly unanimous support. It's the controversial ones that get the attention, and understandably, there are some real differences in opinion on some of those issues, but there's a camaraderie there, and a lot of us are dealing with the same issues, and a lot of people there are there to help their colleagues. The nice thing is, there's no other member of Congress who's interested in running for this seat, so it helps people be helpful to you.
And so, Lawrence, I'll get you teed up. And so, last question from me, Congressman. So, you talk about family. So, what did the kids think?
Yeah, it's funny you ask. The twins were less than a year old when I got elected to the state Senate. And of course, Greta hadn't even been thought of yet. And so when we went up for orientation, Chris came with me. Nagoose was the one who actually said, bring your spouse, if at all possible, to orientation. I'm so glad I did, because she got to meet people in the class and learn a lot about the process. But we're there. It's the longest we'd ever been away from the kids was orientation. And we go to the House gift shop afterwards, which I asked. They don't give employee discounts, even for members. And so I bought the kids T-shirts. And they were just navy blue T-shirts, and it had the House of Representatives seal right here over the kind of the left breast. And I bring them home, and they just didn't care about them at all. Completely unimpressed. But what I came to realize is they really didn't understand the difference between Frankfort and Washington. I got elected on a Tuesday. 9 a.m. Sunday morning, I'm in freshman orientation. And so I think their whole thing was, wait a second, you just got elected and now you're gone? What is this deal going to be like? So when we took them up for the swearing in, they were there with us the whole week of the swearing in, and they got to see the Capitol, and they got to walk on the floor of the House about 15 times before we actually got sworn in. But they got to walk, and they saw it, and they came home, and they didn't take those T-shirts off for a month. And so I think it's been an adjustment for all of us. I don't want to say it's always been roses, but I think they see it's cool and that they're enjoying the ride as well.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Very good. All right, Lawrence, what do we got?
The first question has to do with the bipartisanship you've been talking about. Can you talk about bipartisan relations off camera, and if there are actually regular discussions that are more productive than we see on TV?
Very much so. And again, there are bright lines in politics, right? There are some bright line issues, and think about abortion. Think about some of the issues where you just know you're not going to have a lot of compromise with people right now. But from gun violence to the debt ceiling. You've seen agreements. And I said this before I got elected. I'll say it again. The biggest first test of this Congress was the debt ceiling. That was the big first test. And you've got a slim majority for Kevin McCarthy, who's Speaker right now. And you've got a Freedom Caucus of true extremists who are not interested in government functioning. Now, how do you prevent the country from defaulting in that scenario? And it took House Democrats, it took House Republicans, it took the White House to come together with a deal that I wouldn't have written at all, but all 6 members of the Kentucky delegation voted for to make sure that our country doesn't default on its debt. That is showing how government can work. I think our next big test, and I'm not as optimistic about this one, I think our next big test is the budget. And I hope that we do not careen toward a government shutdown. But again, we have some very difficult members of the House, some real extremists on the Republican side who are not interested in government working. And we're going to have to try and find a way to make sure that we can pass a budget that takes care of the needs of our government and the American people without the pain of a shutdown. So there's been some good bipartisan work amidst the rancor and the fights you've seen in Congress this year. But stay tuned. We've got a lot of work to do.
Quick follow-up to that, this question, how do you fix it? Any thoughts on remedying this situation, the hyper-partisanship, so Congress can carry out its duties on time, including filling open positions in the military?
Yeah, the hyperpartisanship worries me too. And clearly, if I had the fix, I wouldn't hide it. I'd be out there implementing it full force. So I'll go with a simple but difficult solution. It's who we elect. And you've got to elect people who on the front end, again, are committed to their values, right? It's okay to have a value system and represent that in Washington, but are also committed to doing the job, of helping people, to doing the job of passing a budget, of not letting the country default, of keeping people safe, of investing in our infrastructure and our future. That's what we've got to do. And you can disagree on some of that, but have people who are willing to talk about a common set of facts, who are more interested in governing than going on social media and getting likes and clicks, who are more interested in ultimately uniting the country than dividing it. And you all know who I'm talking about. But we need to make sure that we are electing those people. And to that end, if there is a fix that's a policy fix to that, I think it is getting rid of partisan redistricting. The gerrymandering in this country has left so few seats that are actually in play where people could elect a Democrat or a Republican, that what you're seeing is you're seeing one party that only can win a district. And then look at voters. General election voters are different than primary election voters. Primary election voters, there tend to be fewer of them, and they tend to be more towards the ideological extremes of the party. That is who is picking the nominee who is going to win the general based on the partisan redistricting. So I think we've got to watch who we elect, and then we've got to watch how we elect those people and the policy of redistricting. I think that's kind of a way to look at it.
Tom?
Yeah, thank you. What just sort of consistent with Lawrence's question, but and I don't know if you consider Louisville a Biden district, but are there issues that Democrats can effectively work with and pass with Republicans from Biden districts, so to speak?
Yeah, and I would consider this a Biden district. Biden won it by 20 points in 2020, and I'm glad because I think 2020 is actually a bright spot in American democracy, that we, as a country, by about 7 million votes, rejected the politics of extremism, that we rejected the politics of division. And we've got to, hey, look, it's what Ben Franklin was asked at the Constitutional Convention when asked, what kind of government have you given us? He said, a republic if you can keep it. And we can't let that backslide. But I think there's several issues where we can work together. And the debt ceiling being one of them. One issue where I'm getting some bipartisan support right now. The first bill I introduced was the School Meals Expansion Act. And childhood hunger doesn't just affect kids in Louisville. It affects kids all over this country. I don't believe we can call ourselves the richest nation on earth when we have kids who are coming to school hungry and leaving school hungry. So the School Meals Expansion Act would basically make sure that every child in this country has access to good free meal without stigma for breakfast and lunch when they go to school. And we're getting some bipartisan support on that. I'm working on legislation right now in the Small Business Committee to make sure that underrepresented business owners have access to capital to start business. I'm working on a bill I've already introduced with bipartisan support, the Boots to Business program. There are veterans who are trained, are able to participate in small business. We're really working on workforce development issues right now. We're recognizing that, you know what, we need to give everybody a chance for success. But that doesn't necessarily mean a 4-year degree. That you can have a really good career and really good life by going into the trades, by going into professions that we need that don't necessarily require a 4-year degree and require that cost. So I think there are plenty of issues where we can come together, and then the bigger issues. I believe, I'm an optimist. I'm a Democrat in Kentucky. So, you know, I'm an optimist. We can tackle gun violence. In the mass shooting after mass shooting, the school shooting after school shooting, in what is almost a uniquely American problem. It's a problem we can solve. Our government still can work to help people and to keep people safe. And I think that we can, with the right circumstances and the right people, forge those relationships to make that happen.
Dixon, next question is about workforce development. Strong job growth and a changed labor force means many industries are short-staffed. Are there programs or policies at a federal level that can help fill open jobs?
Yes. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it is the economy that is still of primary concern to me and to members of Congress, to making sure that we have jobs and we have people ready to fill those jobs in this country. That includes continuing to invest. It's an investment in education that starts at preschool. You know, we've got one who's going to be in her last year this year in a preschool environment. She shouldn't be special. Every kid in this country should have access to preschool. It's going to help working families. You talk about workforce development. If you're choosing about basically paying another mortgage payment to have your kid in a daycare type setting or going to work, not everybody chooses working, especially on economic conditions. It's going to help with workforce development. It's a generational help. It's getting kids ready for kindergarten. It's getting kids ready for elementary and high school to create those lifelong learners who are equipped to be successful in the modern economy. It's about making sure that we have the trade schools available, that we are making sure that people who want to, we're investing in colleges and universities to limit the burden of student debt that people have to incur to go to college, and also to make sure that there are other options available. So that, I think, is a huge concern. And whether it's from the small business, the veterans, or just investing simply, I'm a member of the Dads Caucus as well, where we're looking at a lot of these issues, the child tax credit, those sorts of things. All these are workforce development issues, which ultimately are paramount.
Kind of a similar question, but about family caregivers. The role of family caregivers in America is monumental, helping to keep our citizens living at home longer. Have you heard of the Assisting Caregivers Today, the ACT Caucus, and what are your thoughts about supporting these caregivers?
I have not heard of the ACT Caucus, but I also have worked on this in the state Senate and am working on a home health bill right now that involves another Kentucky member of Congress, because we know how important this is. We know that there's a lot of people who are wanting to stay at home, that ultimately this can lead to better outcomes and a cost savings in outcomes. We know how much of healthcare is spent at the end of life, and if we can make that better, more efficient and for individuals, and the fact that it might ultimately be a savings, it's a great thing. So that particularly, look, we can look throughout history, and my parents are here today. It's like my first day of school. I'm coming back here at the Louisville Forum as Congressman. My parents are here, but they're baby boomers. My parents are classic baby boomers, and we can look through history as the baby boomers have gone through. The last high school in Jefferson County was built in 1968, Ballard High School. We've watched those baby boomers go through and the bulge sort of that they have created. Now that affects the assisted care that we're talking about. And so that's a concern that does get addressed a lot. I didn't know about the caucus, though, and I'll look into that.
You've mentioned previously how being a freshman affected what committees that you serve on. Is your lack of seniority important in how your opinions or your thoughts, your ideas are received by other members of Congress?
You know, I think there is a respect just for being a member of Congress. There is a respect that, and there again, there's that camaraderie. There's that you're part of this body. Where seniority comes in is committee assignments, office assignments, where your office is. That's a lot of the seniority. But I think we've got to, I can't speak as much for the Republican side yet. I am only 7 months in. On the Democratic side, I think we've got really good leadership. And if you have a good idea, that they're good about listening to it. And, you know, look, somebody might have been working on that issue already. And I think one of the roles we have as freshmen, again, I learned this in the state legislature. State legislature was great training wheels to go to Congress, you know, recognizing there have been people who've been working on these issues before you. Going to them, including them on what you're doing is a better way than just saying I'm the only person who's ever had an idea. But that's kind of basic people skills. So in terms of how the ideas are received, I don't think the seniority matters that much. In terms of the implementation of those ideas, whether you're on a committee, that's where you might need some help and need somebody to sponsor. But you know, I don't think seniority matters as much in how the idea is received. And we've got a great freshman class. You know, it's an interesting freshman class. There's 74 of us, which is a pretty good size class. And unlike most good sized classes, it's fairly evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. And most of the time you get a big class, it's a wave year. Think 2010 with the Tea Party. Think 2018, the Trump midterm. This is 40 Republicans, 34 Democrats. You had a lot of turnover, which created that. We're also the first post-January 6th class, which I don't think gets talked about a lot. And so you've got a lot of members, myself included, who were not there but watching what was happening on our Capitol on January 6th and watching that absolute assault on American democracy, and understand that we're there and we have something to do. It's our job to preserve that. It's our job to pass the policies that work for the American people and make sure that something like that doesn't happen again. So it's a serious class. It's an interesting class. And I think that we get along really well with our colleagues in large part because of it.
Healthcare. Someone asked about a pharmacy benefits managers and reforming parts of the healthcare system. What are your health priorities, healthcare priorities?
I'll start with the pharmacy benefit manager. We've dealt with that in the state Senate when we went after pharmacy benefit managers here in Kentucky. That is also happening on the national level. The pharmacy benefit managers, for those of you guys who don't know, are the middleman. There's been too much vertical integration in the pharmaceutical industry right now, and making sure that people have access to affordable prescription drugs is a major part of healthcare. And the pharmacy benefit managers are not helping, in my opinion, people having access to lower cost prescription drugs. So that's an easy way and a bipartisan way that you're seeing people say, you know, again, no matter what district you live in this country, making sure you have the medicines you need to survive and to thrive is of utmost importance. Healthcare for me is so much. I think that healthcare is a right. And I think that when we look at healthcare, we have to look at this as how do we keep people in this country healthy? Because guess what? If you show up at an emergency room right now and you are really sick, they have to treat you. That's the current law in this country. So we have already said, as a values proposition, when you show up at a hospital and you're really sick, we're going to take care of you. There's some countries where they don't do that. You show up and you're really sick and they ask you, can you pay? And you say no, they literally put you out in the parking lot. That's not what we do here. So when that is already the agreed upon values proposition in that country, I think we owe it to ourselves to say, how do we make that better? How do we take care of people on the front end so that we're not spending so much money on the back end and people are living better, healthier lives. This affects everything from just your quality of life to, we've talked about workforce development. We've talked about a workforce. Having people who are healthy enough to go to work is an important part of it. And so I think it's incredibly important that we continue the success that we've seen of the Affordable Care Act, moved the needle on public health more than any policy in Kentucky in my lifetime. 440,000 Kentuckians had health insurance for the first time because of it, that we continue to move and improve upon that legislation in making sure that people in this country have access and are allowed quality health care, everything from prescription drugs they need to being able to see a doctor for preventative care.
Just a reminder, there's still time to write down your question and raise your hand. We'll come collect it from you. But there's a question about former Congressman John Yarmouth. How did he help you get connected to the right folks in Washington and help you kind of get a jump start on the job?
Congressman Yarmouth, there's a reason his nickname is Congressman Awesome. And he's just fantastic. He has been a help since the election for sure, and in such a wonderful way. You know, he's always there to answer the phone when I call him. And I called him, especially on the debt ceiling stuff, as we were going through the briefings and looking at the pros and cons of that. I mean, John was the former budget chair, so he knows the process. But he's always there to offer advice and encouragement and a blunt assessment of what's going on. But he does it in a way where he answers the call every time, but he doesn't hover. And that's a really fantastic way and something I'll take with me about how to mentor and how to be there for somebody. He also helped, I talked about some of the non-sexy legislation, some of the non-sexy things you can do in an office. You know, the casework that we're doing right now, we talked about constituent services, the casework it belongs to us. It belongs to our office. So there are offices that flip where the member of Congress doesn't give the incoming member that casework. John made sure we had all of that. We lost none of that information, none of that contact, and it helps the people of Louisville out. We kept some of his staff. He did things, retiring members, their budgets look a little different than incoming members. He made sure we had new carpet in the federal building. So little things like that to make sure the transition was as easy as possible. And the fact he's still there to answer questions, he has always been a great guy. He continues to be so.
Congressman, since January 6th, have they've implemented security? Is security changed since you remember being a staffer? Please tell us about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting being up there and talking to the people, including the members of my staff who were there on January 6th, talking to the Capitol police officers who were there on January 6th, some of whom will just readily take out their cell phones and show you video of what it really looked like and the trauma so many of them still suffer from that event. Regardless of what you have heard or seen on the news, it was real, it was awful, and it was incredibly scary for the people who were there. Defending our nation's capital, that building, that monument to democracy. It has changed security. When we have votes, and you're walking across the street to the Capitol or through the tunnel, there is a noticeable presence of heavily armed Capitol Police. There are sometimes for votes, they put up, we call them bike racks. I'm talking about the metal things that literally look like bike racks that come up to about your waist. And they will have the Capitol steps blocked off and guarded by Capitol Police so people can't come through while we're going to votes. Don't try to get anything through the scanners to come into the Capitol. It's very secure right now, and I think that security had increased a lot anyway over the years, but I think that January 6th is certainly a tipping point where you don't joke about security in the Capitol complex right now.
What's been your biggest surprise so far?
The biggest surprise so far. I came from the state legislative world where it really is a do-it-yourself, a DIY environment. And I told people this all the time. When I was in the state Senate, how many staffers did we have? And I'd ask people the question, they would always get it wrong because the answer was 1/3 of a person. Right? when I was leader, I got actually one half of a person. I really moved up in the world. But, I shared a staffer with another senator, or shared a staffer with two other senators for the entirety of the time I was there. If you emailed me, you got me. If you got a response, it came from me. If you called, you got me. It came from me. We were the ones doing all of that work. So one of the biggest surprises is just the scale of this job and the importance of staff. I went from having one half or one third of a person to a staff of about 20 people now that we had to hire and get up and running in about 2.5 months. And all of the issues and all of the things that come through, it's been really hard for me to let go of some of that. I thought, that I would still have the same type of role I did in the state Senate, and really, you've got to have so much trust in the people you work with on a daily basis to make sure that everyone who's reaching the office is getting what they need. One of the surprises has been truly the importance of staff and everything from responding to constituents to taking meetings. My legislative assistants, and you might remember this from your time in working for a senator, is if you come to DC and you talk to one of my legislative assistants, that is the same as talking to me. That they really know those issues. They do a great job. They brief me on it afterwards, but I might be in a committee or might be somewhere else, and having those people help you out has taken some getting used to for me.
Along the same lines, you've been in the minority party in Frankfurt. Now you're in the minority in Washington. What's the difference? How does it operate differently as far as what you're able to do or not do?
Thank you for pointing that out again, Lawrence. And, to some extent, I said, throw me in that briar patch again. I got up there, and there are several members, the huge class of Democrats in 2018. There's a lot of people in the Democratic caucus who've never served in the minority. And of course, they're telling me how bad it is. I'm like, guys, this is great. I haven't seen this many Democrats in my entire life. There's 212 other Democrats in Washington right now. I'm like, oh my God, this is a convention in Kentucky. So it's been great. But it's different. And what I will say, what's different about it is in Frankfurt, the majority had absolute control. I mean, really absolute control, to the extent if they didn't want to give you an office, you didn't have to have an office. And hey, look, Democrats were in charge. They weren't angels either in Kentucky. I mean, the majority has incredible power in Frankfurt. In Washington, the majority still has the power, right? That's why you want to be in the majority. It's why you want to be speaker. It's why you want to assign the committee chairs and really influence the flow of legislation. But I think there's more of an institutional respect for both parties. And so you have ranking members. You have guaranteed time for debate for both parties, both in committee and on the floor. Where in Frankfurt, they can just cut that off. They don't have to allow any debate. And my last year in Frankfurt was miserable in that regard. You'd be in committee and the Republicans just wouldn't let the minority talk. They didn't have to. That would never happen in Washington. So I do think that there is more of a respect for the minority party in Washington, and whether that comes from just, again, the way the institution has operated for the last couple hundred years, or whether maybe even a recognition that it does change back and forth up there, and the people who are going to be, who are in the minority now, very well might not be in the minority after the 2024 elections. I don't think that's lost on people. So it's I would say it's more collegial and more respectful in Washington.
Congressman, have you made a mistake since you've been in Congress? And if so, what's the biggest one?
Well, of course. If you introduce me to the perfect person, all have sinned and come short of the glory. What's a mistake I'm trying to think of right now? I think it's just making. Well, I'll tell you one. It didn't actually carry out into an actual mistake, but people ask you to do stuff all the time, and I'm used to saying yes. And someone asked, it was about a staff member, if a staff member could serve in a position, and of course I said sure. And my chief of staff, who's been in Washington for a while, said, "Have you asked ethics about that?" And I go, "Oh," which of course then ethics said, "No, they can't do that." And so we regretfully said no. But I think it's the mistakes are coming from just making sure you're learning the ropes, and everything from how do you get through the Rayburn building, which the Rayburn House office building, I'm convinced actually isn't a shape.
I know what you mean.
And if it is a shape, it actually changes at 2 a.m. every night. I mean, you got to know where you're going. I don't have anybody walk with me right now, but I don't always get there in a timely fashion. So, and I think the other thing is the State Senate was really good training wheels. But even when you're thinking about things, just this week, I had somebody ask me to write a letter on behalf of the UAW. And of course, normally you just say yes, yes, yes to that. And your staff says, "Have you checked with Congresswoman Debbie Dingell? Have you checked with the Labor Caucus?" Making sure that you're running the traps of being a member of a larger body, of a body with people who've been there for a long time. And so we go, okay, yeah, right. It's those little things. And that's, again, where everyone's going to make mistakes. It's making sure you've got a good team around you that minimizes those mistakes and minimizes the effect of them.
You mentioned the Freedom Caucus. You said that they weren't interested in governing. Expand on that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that it truly is a group of extremists, and you saw it starting with the speaker vote. Look, we have to have a speaker. We couldn't get sworn into Congress until we had a speaker. That's how it works. And so the majority party gets to choose the speaker, and they refuse to do it. They made a big public show of it. On the debt ceiling, they really were willing to have the country default on its debt. What does that mean to us? Well, first of all, let's explain what it is. I remember this Christmas, I've been on the campaign trail for a while and maybe was feeling a little guilty. And so when I got the credit card bill in January, I honestly gasped. But I had to pay it because I'd already spent the money and given the gifts. The debt ceiling in this country is not the budget. That's what we do now. The debt ceiling is the money we have already spent as a country, and we must pay because it's our obligation. Not doing so causes us to default. Yes, it downgrades our credit. Practically, what does it mean for us? The benefits of Social Security for nearly 100,000 Louisvillians are on the table, at risk of not being there. It is not responsible governing to default on the country's debt, to weaken the American dollar and our standing in the world. There are countries right now who do not want the American currency to be dominant. And the members of the Freedom Caucus just threw all that to the wind. We don't care if people get hurt if they don't have their Social Security. We don't care if it hurts America's standing in the world or our economy or our jobs. We're going to let the country default. Why? Now we're looking at the budget. That's our job. And one of the primary purposes of being a legislator, and I love being a legislator, is that we control the purse strings. That's what you do at the Metro Council. It's what you do in the state Senate. It's what you do in the United States Congress. We are the appropriators. That's our job. But they're willing to have the government shut down, which will not only put some people out of work, it's going to deny people services who need them. Pass a budget. Look, I might vote against it because it might not reflect my priorities and my values. But it's our job and it's your job in the majority party to do that. And I think it's hard to negotiate with people who want to kill the hostages. And that's what you see the extremists in the Freedom Caucus do right now. If you're looking for how extreme the Freedom Caucus is, they just kicked out Marjorie Taylor Greene. Okay? That's where they view governing at this moment. It's not responsible, it's not tenable, and it will ultimately hurt us.
I know you don't see this up close, but as a Democrat, assess how you believe Speaker McCarthy is doing in his job.
It's interesting. People talk all the time about the slim majority and the terrible time he has governing. I'm just going to point out that Nancy Pelosi had the same majority when she was Speaker of the House. And the House Democrats passed legislation that's going to get every Kentuckian access to broadband and high-speed internet, that we lowered the cost of prescription drugs, that we passed the most comprehensive and meaningful climate change legislation in the history of our country, that we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which helped lower inflation and has kept inflation on a downward trajectory since its passage in this country. And so I think she showed what can be done when you have a slim majority if you are willing to put in the work and legislate. I think Speaker McCarthy has a tough time. He has the Freedom Caucus. But I think that what I'd like to see is more reaching across the aisle. The success of the debt ceiling negotiations showed that congressional Democrats still are willing to work with congressional Republicans on responsible legislation. In fact, more Democrats voted for that bill than Republicans. 164 Democrats voted for that bill, 149 Republicans voted for that legislation. So I think that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see if the Freedom Caucus is causing that many problems, then reach out. There's other people in Congress who are willing to get stuff done.
I think we have time for one more question, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Iris. Congressman, last question. We got a couple questions about the Supreme Court. One of them is about the ethical issues in the Supreme Court right now. Is that something that's on your radar?
It is. And by the way, it's so funny to hear both Iris and Tom call me Congressman. As I tell people all the time, it's just Morgan. That's what I do. This is who I am. I've co-sponsored 3 pieces of legislation right now to impose ethical standards on the Supreme Court. I wish we didn't have to do that. I wish that the Supreme Court had seen the ethical problems of accepting an RV or someone paying for your mom's house or private jet travel or school tuition reimbursement or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in lavish benefits being given to you by people who will ultimately come before you for a decision. But how do our institutions ultimately operate? We can talk about the day-to-day function or how you actually submit a brief to the United States Supreme Court. But our institutions ultimately function because the American people still have faith that they will work. And when we see behavior like what we've seen from Justice Thomas, I think it weakens people's faith in the institution. The court had already been somewhat politicized by Leader McConnell's actions to stall the vote to fill Justice Scalia's seat with Merrick Garland because he said a presidential election was coming and that's when the people would decide. And then to rush through in incredibly fast fashion the replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, even though a presidential election was even closer than it was for Scalia. And so we can't afford to have our faith in the judicial branch, a third and so important co-equal branch of government that provides so many checks and balances. We can't afford to have that faith weakened anymore. And that's why I think that we need to make sure the Supreme Court has those ethical standards in place so that people have faith in our institutions. And look, America, it's what Winston Churchill said. Democracy is the worst form of government except for every other one they've tried. And I will always believe America's best days are in front of us. But it's what I said at the beginning. It's not guaranteed. As Congressman David Obey once said, democracy doesn't guarantee a happy ending. It is up to us to make sure that our country succeeds, that our institutions endure, that anybody can go in front of the court system and have their grievance addressed in a fair, blind, equitable manner. That our government in the legislature is there to help people out, to keep people safe, to invest in our future. And that government is ultimately of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's what we have to continue to do. And at this moment in time, it is so important that we not give up that faith and that we continue to do so.
Please join me in thanking Congressman Morgan McGarvey. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.